So one of the reasons I'm a libertarian is because that's what the Founding Fathers envisioned.
The people of the United States.
We've moved so far away from the Constitution that in many ways we don't even recognize it.
In order to form a more...
We think that we're becoming more advanced by abandoning the Constitution and adopting something like an administrative state. But what we're in fact doing is becoming more primitive. We are regressing.
The founders were trying to create a regime of liberty.
Have you ever heard a libertarian or a right-winger talk about the Founding Fathers? They talk about them like they're these people who were against all taxation, all regulation, and people who were against any sort of government action and any sort of government solving problems. And what these libertarians and right-wingers do is they take history and they manipulate it into causing everyone to think that the Founding Fathers want the same things that they want. So anyone who wants to use government to improve society are people who are going against the Founding Fathers' intent for what they thought the country should be. And this is just not true. And this is just not how they thought. And this is just not how they behaved. Even if you look at like corporations in the 1790s, to become a corporation, they had to go to the government and they had to tell them like how, or they had to be approved for how much stock they could sell, how much they could capitalize, how much money they could bring in when they initially sell their stock. They also had to be accountable for what they do with the money. And the government wasn't just going to let anyone incorporate. You had to have a solid plan for what you were going to do with the money, and you had to be responsible with it. And also, they wouldn't set unlimited time limits on corporations. They would only give them a charter that lasted for a certain amount of time. So they had so many regulations for corporations, and corporations in the 1790s were much more heavily regulated than they are now, as you can see with companies like Walmart and Goldman Sachs and ExxonMobil, who just treat our country like it's their own personal outhouse. And that stuff actually would not fly with the Founding Fathers. Even a quote I'll pull from James Madison: "The power of all corporations ought to be limited." That's a straightforward quote. They can't change the history on that. And the thing about James Madison is that he was really big into separation of powers and checks and balances and having a bicameral legislature. And so part of the checks and balance process for James Madison and the Founding Fathers was also having a check on corporations. But you only hear libertarians talking about taxes and all those kinds of things. But here's a James Madison quote that just proves the exact opposite. And even if we look at someone like Thomas Jefferson, right? That's their guy. Thomas Jefferson, no taxation, no regulation. And that's also not true. As you know, Jefferson was an anti-federalist. So it's not that he believed that the government shouldn't have any power. He believed that the power shouldn't be concentrated in a central government and that there should be states that have the power. So that's a lot different from saying he's a libertarian. And he was certainly okay with the state taxing you and the state regulating you, but just not a central government. So that's just so much different than, what they propose in the voluntary taxes and how Jefferson would roll over in his grave if he knew about we had an income tax. He'd probably just care more that it's a federal income tax and a state income tax for him. I mean, he's not here, but we just have to go by that he's an anti-federalist and not a libertarian, and that was not his ideology. And to pull another quote, Jefferson had many quotes bashing corporations, but even if you look at Ben Franklin, here's a quote from Ben Franklin that I think is really interesting. And everyone's heard this. This is like a saying everyone says: nothing can be certain except death and taxes. So when he says that, what is he really saying? He's saying that death and taxes are these unfortunate realities that, although they're horrible things like death, that's a horrible thing, It's something that's a part of life, and it's something that we have to deal with. And so he said this in 1789, nothing can be certain except death and taxes. And so try to come to him with this voluntary taxes thing. That was not what he thought. He knew taxes were a part of life. It was about having the representation in Congress, and it was about having a government that worked for people. So to just use these founding fathers that they were on board with how a libertarian would think is just not true. Even to look at the Whiskey Rebellion from 1794, that was, if you've ever heard of that, that was in 1794. They taxed whiskey, and so that's a tax. And farmers in Pennsylvania were really upset at the tax, and they had a rebellion. And so the government squashed that rebellion. So it's just so funny that they tax you, and then if you have a rebellion about it, they squash the rebellion. So doesn't that prove that taxes, they realize, are certainly part of life, and that if you don't like a tax, you can't just have a rebellion, that you have to repeal a tax legislatively. And this is actually a really damning one. In 1791, the Washington administration actually had a bailout for banks because there was a huge recession in 1791. So that's the Washington administration, and that's them doing something that even now Republicans don't agree with doing. And so I think that's damning. And after the bailout, after the banking crisis of 1791, they formed the first national bank to deal with banking crisis that go on in America. So I just think that's funny, because if you look at like Woodrow Wilson, and when we had a bunch of banking crises, we eventually created a central bank and the Federal Reserve. And that's something libertarians rail on Woodrow Wilson about, putting in a central bank and how that's government overreach. But let's not forget the fact that Washington and his administration did the same exact thing as Woodrow Wilson did. So you can't use that Washington wouldn't have appreciated a Federal Reserve Bank. That's not a legitimate argument against having a central bank. And also my thing about, like, they hate Wilson for that, but not the fact that Woodrow Wilson was a giant racist. They just hate him for passing bipartisan legislation. By the way, that was not just Woodrow Wilson who wanted the central bank. That was everybody in America, and that was Republicans and Democrats on both sides of the aisle. And even speaking of racism, let's circle back here. The Founding Fathers. Have I mentioned yet that they all owned a bunch of slaves? So when we try and say that they were libertarians and they were these small government people and they were just about freedom, how about the contradiction in the fact that they actually owned other human beings? And actually, John Adams was the only founding father not to own slaves. And he was an advocate on moral grounds to not have slavery. And they've all heard these arguments. So they all sat in the same chair that John Adams sat in, and they came to a very different conclusion. Why? Because they weren't libertarians. That was not their ideology. And libertarians always try and throw the Founding Fathers in your face, when that's not true. And even talking about John Adams, he himself, even though he didn't have slaves, you know what he did? In 1789, when he was president, he passed the Sedition Act, which was fine or imprisonment for obstructing federal law or publishing false writings against the government. So here's your so-called freedom-fighting libertarian passing one of the most disgusting pieces of legislation in American history. And this is not a law today, but they passed a law that you can't publish false writings against Congress. and that it's up to fine or imprisonment for even obstructing federal law in any way. So does that sound like a libertarian, voluntary taxes, government just get out of the way kind of person to you? No, it doesn't. And the thing that libertarians don't realize is that it was a farming nation, and we went from farming and living off the fat of the land to being a more connected society where there were more interactions among people. And when more things interact, the government has to step in more often and keep things situated and regulated. That's just part of getting better as a society. And even as we grow and we build roads and we build rocket ships and we do all these things, that this is what the founding fathers would have wanted. Even if you can see in Jefferson's administration, they built a national road, or they passed a law to build a national road from Maine to Ohio, because Ohio was like a new territory that they either acquired or were trying to acquire. So they wanted a road that went there. That's government doing something to solve a problem, similar to Dwight Eisenhower in the 50s building a bunch of highways. So even that how would you build the roads argument, look at Thomas Jefferson, the poster boy. That's his legislation in 1806 for a national road. So I just think altogether this libertarian ideology of they're trying to pass along this nonsense of the founding fathers and what they believed in, it shows no bearing of actual historical accuracy. And I'm just tired of it. So if you're tired of it too, please subscribe to my channel, because we're going to be having plenty more videos like this. Thank you for listening.